and that will be on the slide at the end as well. Thank you so much. So let's begin with this topic that, again, appears to be one that many people are in need of kind of understanding, whether it's for themselves and their own families, or it is as a professional working with families. But like aging itself, this is a topic that impacts us all, because the reality is that no matter how much money we have or titled property, most of us all have some type of non-titled personal possessions that we all have to decide what we're going to do with them in the end. I always like to begin every topic with this now ubiquitous slide that just is one that I think speaks to our lives as humans, that there are things in our lives that we can control, things that we can influence, and things we cannot control. And when we're talking about situations that involve other people, we really have less control over the end result than it is when it's something that is just of our own making. So my hope is that by the end of this time together, that you will have a better sense of ways you can influence this situation and improve upon the end result, even if you recognize that you cannot control all aspects of it. So as we move through the slides today, really think about this question. How will your family story be told? And probably your answer will not just be reflective of this particular topic, but it will be reflective of many different types of topics within your family story. Because again, how we react in one situation often shows how we play out in other situations. King Solomon is a very important figure in biblical and historical kind of perspective, particularly when it comes to dividing of assets. And probably if we go back in history, which I am not a huge history buff, but if we go back in history, he was probably the first who had to make any division of assets. And of course, the famous story of the baby that two women were saying was their own. I think that we typically are more on the other side of this, where we really struggle with how we divide personal belongings, titled or untitled, and we're going to get into the definition of those. And so it really does become more of a king of the jungle kind of situation, where it is just an all-in kind of fight over possessions. And my goal is that you will walk away with tools to really, no matter what your family history is in regards to the division of assets and how family dynamics play out, that I hope that you will have some additional tools to be able to do something better. Hold on, we have a few people who are saying that they're unable to hear me. If those who can hear me, if you can just type in that you're able to hear. Okay, perfect, thank you. Unfortunately, there are times that some people's audio is going to have a difficulty with hearing, but it does look like we have the majority are able to hear. Again, it will be on YouTube later within the next 24 hours. So if you do have any difficulty, please feel free to visit the Synergy Home Care YouTube channel. So what brought you here today to this particular topic? We had over 250 people around the country sign up for today's webinar, which to me definitely shows how impactful this particular topic is. And I think that probably everybody has a different reasoning for coming and wanting to discuss this and hear about it. So were you wanting to come today because you wanted to start the process within your own family? Were you wanting to understand what scenarios are the most contentious so that you can try to avoid those? Are you trying to figure out ways to make this easier for your family? Maybe you are the one who are looking at starting to divide possessions. Are you trying to determine how best to talk with family members about this situation? And really the ways you figure out how to talk about this situation, which can be so emotionally charged, will really help you in talking about many situations. Or are you really just needing to find a very clear plan of how to do this? I believe that for each of you, no matter what brought you to today's session, each of you will be able to walk away with a way of kind of handling and answering your question. So I think the most important is really starting with a definition and what is non-titled property. Typically, any type of property that can be moved, can be touched or felt, and does not have a formal title document that shows the ownership and transfer rights of that property is non-titled property. So when we think about this, it really is those possessions that are in one's home. It's the jewelry. It's the art that's hanging on the walls. It's the books that are in the shelves. It is the utensils that are in the kitchen drawer. It is the vase that has sat on the holiday table for years, filled with fresh flowers from one of the parents, always. That is the property that we're talking about. And as you think about that, you probably can immediately come to think about one particular item. And while there's probably many, there's probably one that stands out for each of you that really reflects upon who your family is and what you most remember about your family home, about your time with a family member. And that is why, because that memory is so clear and so visual and emotional, that you become so emotionally connected to this particular topic. It's important as we begin this conversation, as with any conversation that has other players involved and emotions at the heart of it, that we really know the issues that you want to address and that we stay on topic. It is very easy, particularly when you're talking about family conversations, that a conversation that has a goal and a focus quickly can devolve into a conversation that we did not mean to bring up, but which inevitably gets connected. This particular conversation can easily connect to, well, of course you would think that mom is going to leave you that piece of jewelry because you always thought that mom you were mom's favorite. And then what emotions come from that? Or, of course, you think that you're going to get that because you happen to have children and I don't, and once again, I lose out. Or mom always gives you extra money anyway. Whatever it is, you need to be focused on the topic at hand and the issue that you're wanting to address. You also need to know why you want to talk about transferring property. What prompted the interest? Was it that you saw a story on this? Was it that you are just received a diagnosis and are recognizing that there may be a more limited life expectancy and this is a good time? Is it that maybe you're moving and you recognize how many boxes of items you have, and instead of moving them, you decided that you would rather start giving things away now? So for each of us, there's a reason that today is the day that we want to start the conversation. As we move closer to the holiday season into Christmas and Hanukkah and times where we're going to be getting together with family members, we also sometimes think this is the best time to address these issues because we're all going to be together. But please remember, how much time do you have at this holiday meal, and how focused are the other players who are going to be part of this going to be able to be? And if you don't have enough time for this, if you have a limited time together, don't start a conversation that you may not be able to end and that may not end well, and that will end up kind of ruining the time together. This may be something that you want to do at a different time that is specifically focused on this particular topic, and that may not have as many different people in the room. This may not be the time to have a conversation when grandchildren are here or friends of the family are in the room. This really may be a more limiting group of people that are going to have this conversation. What outcome are you looking for? Are you looking for a decision in writing? Are you hoping to be able to meet with an attorney altogether? Are you hoping for at least a family meeting or an initial conversation to see where everybody is at? So really think about what is your goal for putting this together and how that may or may not differ from other people's goals. Because again, this is not going to be just about you. As we think about the conversation, it's really important to think about taking the story out of the personal and making it more impersonal so that people's defenses are down a little bit. It's better to have a conversation by starting to say, you know, a friend of mine recently shared that they were starting to look at some division of possessions. And, you know, it's a conversation maybe we've had before, but I think maybe we need to revisit it. Or I read an article, or I happen to be listening to a webinar. So sometimes taking it out of the personal is a really good way of getting people to not be so defensive and to let down a little bit and be able to really hear the context of the conversation and not be just thinking about how they're going to respond. As with any conversation, particularly those that are emotional, it is really being able to use I statements, not what other people are doing, not what you think other people are going to say, but this is about what you need to say. So really think about using those I statements. And often that's a practice. That's something that doesn't come naturally to us often, particularly when we become emotional. So really practice that. The other thing is you may need to be prepared to respond to questions. Why you're doing this. Maybe in your family, bringing this topic of conversation up is, seen as selfish or greedy, even if that is not at all your reasoning for doing this, and you're really trying to avoid a bad situation. And be prepared to come back for more discussion. As with any difficult emotional conversation, we should never think that one conversation is going to resolve it, or a goal and a plan will be completely set by it. And if we do, then we're going to feel that we failed in some way and that the initial conversation was not successful because we only have the goal of completing it in mind. And that's really not a fair way to approach a conversation. So why does this become so complicated? I have spent the last 30 years of my professional life as a social worker in a variety of roles. And one of those roles was as a hospice social worker for many years back in Minnesota. And it was fascinating to me, and it was really kind of one of the beginning reasons that I started doing these seminars on this particular topic, because I had a family, and that when I was meeting with a daughter, we were in the home of her dad. Her dad was in the other room, and really based on his condition, he was actively dying. we anticipated that within probably 24 to 48 hours, his journey would be ended. And instead of this daughter being able to focus on her time left with her dad and the grief that she was anticipating, her biggest fear and the piece that she wanted to speak with me about was what was going to happen after his death with the rest of the family, because she had seen such a negative experience with other family members' deaths when people started to kind of come into the home and begin to just take items out. And it was really impactful for me to know that, again, she couldn't focus on her grief because she had to go right into almost a protective mode and a fear-based mode. Every family has a different process of how they communicate. Every family has a different definition of what fair means. And every family has a different definition of who are the players that get to be part of this conversation. And that's what we're going to talk about now and really get a little deeper into this part. I often will talk about the idea of a legacy of communication. And really what I mean is that every family has, quote unquote, their way, which often makes sense, except when it doesn't. And it often makes it difficult to do something different than what has been done in the past. And it often becomes even more difficult because as we age and we've moved on from having ongoing conversations with our family of origin, we learn different ways, which may be similar to what we grew up with, or maybe very, very different to what we have known in the past. This became really clear to me one day when this was probably several years back, and I had come to visit my parents, and I was having a very open conversation with my mom about some items in the house. And it was talking about this one item that we call the Green Lady. And this is a very old antique green crystal Art Deco piece that is part of a vase. And I shared with my mom that was a piece that I really hoped to have and inherit, that I knew my sister liked that piece, but I knew my sister really liked an antique sofa that my mom had as well. And I said, if Steph is okay with her having the antique sofa and me having the Green Lady, does that work? And my stepson stared at me with his mouth open. He must have been 14 and could not believe that I was having this conversation with my mom. And he shared with me later, like, how can you even have that conversation? And what he didn't realize, because of his kind of communication style with his part of his family, which was so different than mine, was that this was a conversation that I grew up with, that my family always had these conversations, always talked about this. It was something that was important to my mom, that we were open about this because she never wanted to have an argument. We always knew, my sister and I, that it was my parents who would direct how things were divided, but that when we were asked, they wanted open feedback from us. So it clearly shows that so many families have very varying differences in how they communicate and how that process is done. Think about, have you been left in the dark over the years? Or has the process of dividing assets been an open topic? Did you hear about what happened when your parents passed away and how division of assets was done? If not, then this again is something that is much more taboo and happens, but we don't have conversation about it. Who are the players in this conversation? How have items been passed down in past generations? And again, while you don't need to follow this lead, changing it now may create its own conflict. So really think about, what's come before. Think about family structures, which now have become much more complex. and create more drama in regards to the handing down of personal property. And now there are step families and new marriages, and your siblings may have marriages that are only a few years old, where you come to this discussion with a partner or spouse that are decades old, and how does fair equal when other people haven't been along for the ride as long, and the trust may not be there that they're going to be staying for a long period of time, and what happens to assets that get down to one that may not stay within that family. And again, how do step families, spouses, younger generations, and close friends enter into the equation? Who gets to have a voice? And that's really, really important. I think that the fewer people for the initial conversation who have a voice, the better. That it often becomes more drama-filled if, for instance, spouses are included in the initial conversation, because their sole focus often is the protection of one spouse's kind of emotional health. And if they see them becoming upset, angry, sad because of what somebody else said, they're going to kind of jump to their defense. And now it becomes kind of maybe a 2-on-1 type of discussion. And so really think about who should be involved in not only the conversation, but the determination of who receives what. When we think about what fair means, that's also a really important activity that everybody needs to have. Because does fair always mean equal? In many families, everybody got the exact same gift at the holidays because no one wanted to be seen as being a favorite, even though maybe not everybody in the family needed another pair of pajamas. But because Sally and Billy got pajamas, Johnny and Mary have to get pajamas too. Although really what they needed were some sweaters, but that could be seen as unfair. So what does fair mean in your family, and does it always mean equal? And when we think about equality, when we think about fairness, do we look at it based solely on financial equality? That everything that people get handed down has to have an equal financial value? And how is that determined? Does it have an equal emotional value? And the reality is that very rarely when we talk about these items is emotion thought of in the same way for each family member for each item. Again, that green lady to me has a much different value emotionally than it did maybe for my sister. I think of it differently when I think about how I would use it in my life and the way I entertain versus somebody else and the way they would entertain. Is it equal in number of items? That no matter what, as long as in front of everybody at the end, everybody has 10 items, we've done it right. And finally, the equal number of meaningful items, which is even more difficult to determine because meaning comes from within and from individual people versus somebody being able to ascribe a value to it. So these are all questions that as you're going through this process is really important for you to think about for yourself and maybe have others do as an exercise as well. And when I talk about that as an exercise, I would do it individually and then bring it to the table together. We also have to consider the timing of the distribution, because that will also influence the potential methods of distribution. So are we looking at this as prior to someone's death or after the person's death? And families are often, again, this is often a historical legacy type of discussion. In some families, People want to give away items before their death because they really want to see that person enjoying them, taking pleasure in it. But for others, that is not done. And I think sometimes in part because when we do it prior to our death, we have to deal with the fallout ourselves. We have to feel with some of the emotional kind of minefields as to why we made the decision that we made. After our death, it is not ours to have to watch. And it's sometimes easier to, not because we're doing it with ill intent, but it's just easier to know they'll handle it. Let them deal with it. I won't be around. And honestly, you hear that often in jest where people will say that, but really there's some truth to that. One of the things that really is something to consider is that prior to one's death, you really do get the opportunity to not only share the history and the story behind an item, but really get to see that person take pleasure in it. And especially as we get older, and I think it's for many of us not as easy to buy a gift for one another. It's also a nice way to be given something of real meaning without having to go out and spend money on something that may not really spend much time in one's home or be utilized. Again, I know in my own family now for big birthday presents and big birthdays or anything that ends in a 0 or a 5, that instead of, it's something that my parents have always taken a real desire to ensure that those gifts are really ones that are remembered in a different way than maybe just a gift card at a normal kind of typical birthday. And I remember that on one of my big birthdays, I won't say which year, but one of my big birthdays, I shared with my mom that there was nothing really that I wanted from, the outside kind of shopping world. But if she wanted to choose a piece of jewelry that she knew that would someday be given down to me, that I would prefer to have that as the birthday gift, to be able to have the story behind it, to be able to wear it when she was around, than anything else. And that's exactly what she did. And it was out in the open. It was something that my sister knew that I was receiving. It was not something that she had ever wanted or would be her style. So it really was a great way of being able to distribute something in that way. Keeping the memories intact really is a big piece of why we even think about handing down these items, because honestly, if we didn't have memories attached to them, it'd be very simple to just do a giant yard sale or estate sale and just divide the money. It's much easier to divide money and dollar bills than it is to divide these items. But the reason that we don't do that and the reason that we struggle with this is often because there are so many memories that are connected to these type of items. And no matter what the process your family uses to divide personal property, it's always good to have the family history attached to as many items and photos as possible. And nowadays, there are a variety of ways that we can do this. As a family, share stories and have someone record or videotape that process. There's a lot of companies that do memory books and history books, both in a written and visual format. And this is a great way to really be able to share stories which stay with us as as long a period of time as anything else. We can describe the item and why it's special and be able to really talk about those times that it was seen in the family or utilized. And that's a great way of bringing people together, and also particularly with younger generations, being able to involve them in this sharing of stories. Photo books with descriptors are a wonderful way to preserve memories. And it was interesting, I was contacted by a woman actually in Michigan who is doing this as a business, who does kind of photo books with the idea that they really become living history and almost museum books of one's contents of one's life. And it's a great way, both as a space saver, because the reality is we can't keep everything that maybe we want. And if we do, it's often in storage, which does not reflect its emotional meaning. But we can put it in a book that is on our coffee table and viewed numerous times by both ourselves and our family members and younger generations and friends of, the items that make up one's life story, with the actual description about it, with when it was given, how it was given, by whom it was given. So we have within our technology some wonderful ways of being able to do that. There is great creative coping, as I call it, with technology. Again, photo books that really become the living history of a room full of items. Or we can utilize jewelers, for instance, if there's a special ring or a special piece of jewelry, which is a one-off. You can't divide it. Solomon can't divide that piece of jewelry except with a very sharp pickaxe, probably. But why not have that piece of jewelry that may have some wonderful memories copied, and some of the money from the sale of some other items or from the financial will aspect be used so that everybody in the family who is wanting that item, that copy, gets it. And while the reality is that, yes, there is only one quote unquote real item, it's not about that item. It's about the memories. It's about the history. It's about remembering when your dad wore that bracelet or that watch, and when your mom wore that ring. And so there's wonderful ways to make copies. This began for me really thinking about this creative coping when I had a client many years ago, a hospice client. He was a fairly well-known artist and had many original pieces that all of his family members and children wanted. The reality with art is there's only one original. And again, dividing those up and cutting those canvases takes away from the piece. So what I suggested to the family, and what they ultimately did, was have each of these pieces that the family wanted to each have a copy of, high resolution, high art quality copies made. He was still alive, and he was able to sign each of them as if it was an original. They used money from the estate to then have all of these framed in a high quality way. And the original ones kind of went into a kind of a bucket, and each family member just chose a number that was associated with an original piece of art. They got the original that they had chosen by this number system. And all of the other pieces, they had this high quality copy that was still signed by their dad. Again, sometimes it's not about one way or the other, but really about finding a third way. And that's really, in reality, the most ethical way of doing it. It's not always about right and wrong. It's about finding a new way, a different way. There are many different distribution methods to consider. And so we're going to go over a few of these. The reality is, when it comes to legal documents, you want to check with an estate attorney. Many states allow to have a codicil, an added document to a will that shows and documents how personal property is to be divided. Within the will, there would be mention of this list, and then the list is connected with the legal document itself. The issue with that is often things change, new conversations are had, new items are added, and we don't typically kind of go back on a regular basis to update those. So even with that, there may be some items that have been forgotten or not included. One way is gifts, as I shared, that certain items are given before one's death and enjoyed for a birthday or, a holiday or any of those. And again, it is out in the open and seen. It's important that the reasoning for doing it is kind of known. I think particularly if one person is going to be kind of bestowed upon for an item that there is a lot of emotional attachment to, that it should be addressed in the open, because it can be an uncomfortable situation depending on how it is done. I had an experience as marrying into a family where there was a grouping of jewelry from an aunt who had never been married, a great aunt who had never been married, and she had very specific reasons as to why she wanted to give this grouping of jewelry to me versus some of the other her other nieces, and in part because we had a girl who she wanted it to be passed down to. This was outside of the typical way that this family dealt with these type of items. It typically went to the next generation, who then would bring it to the next generation. So it was out of the box thinking, and I was at a Christmas celebration in front of all the family. I got to open a gift from this favorite aunt. And there in the box was this jewelry, which while I was very honored and touched by, it was the most uncomfortable Christmas after that, because she had not shared with anybody else that she was going to be bestowing this on me. And it became kind of a bone of contention within the family for a long time. So it's important that conversation is had, particularly if you are going outside of the norm for your family. Verbal promises, which we often hear, well, mom told me she was going to give this to me. She wanted me to have this, is really, kind of in the realm of hearsay. And I am not an attorney, but we know that hearsay doesn't hold up a lot. So that becomes very difficult unless in a family there is a lot of trust. And trust often may be there prior to an incident, but at the moment of kind of emotional charged nature of things, often can dissipate for a while. So verbal promises is not a great idea. Labeling can lead to some problems as well. If you go to some people's houses and if you happen to look at a piece of art, or you liked a plate and you wanted to see who was the maker of that plate and you turn it over, you may be surprised to see a sticker on the bottom that says Mary's name on it. Because in some families, literally, someone has gone around with a sticker maker and just kind of put people's names on things. The problem with that is in some families, those stickers can be taken off one item and placed on another, unbeknownst to kind of everybody except that person who is doing that. So labeling has its downsides. Estate sales, garage sales. So what some families will do is, particularly not necessarily for all of the items, but for maybe some of the items, is they will sell them at an estate sale or a garage sale and then split the proceeds. And that's kind of their way out of having to do a division. Sometimes it's just that there's so many items to divide and people have their own items that you don't need anymore. And so these are kind of the agreed upon sale items that get done in that way. Again, maybe those photos have been taken, they've been put in a photo book, and people are really comfortable with having that memory. Donation is another way. Sometimes families will just donate items. Again, because there is an excess of items, they don't have an emotional value to them. Maybe they don't even have quite a financial value, but people want to do the right thing. Maybe it's with clothing or other items. The thing we want to avoid is what we would consider disappearing acts, where after the death, you go back into the home after, all of the funeral is completed, and all of a sudden you're looking for several items and they're no longer there. You knew they were there, but they're no longer there. And that becomes a very difficult situation because, again, trust is now broken. Depending on the size of the family, we may never know who did that. And you may never see the item in that person's home because either you're no longer invited to that person's home because all of this has created such a division in the family, or they are kind of aware enough to put that item away when family members are coming, so no one else gets to see that they took it. And again, my hope is that what we're doing today in these kind of conversations limit that ever happening for a family. Some families do family distribution games. They take dice, and if you roll a certain number, you get to go around the house and pick out your favorite item. Or you pull a number out of a hat, and then, it goes from 1 to 10, and then the next person, it goes, 10 to 1. So different ways of doing that. Families sometimes will distribute based on age. And so they'll kind of take the oldest to the youngest and let everybody choose an item. I have a very visceral reaction and a very visceral kind of emotion to this. I remember as a young girl sitting around my grandmother's living room with my 10 other cousins, and having my grandmother's Hummel figurines in the middle. I was the youngest of the 10, and so the way that the family determined this was that it went from the oldest to the youngest to choose one of these Hummel figures. And in my mind, and even though I was really a little girl, I remember thinking how many times I would visit my grandmother versus some of my cousins, and the close nature of our relationship versus what I perceived as their relationship. And the cousin would choose a Hummel, and I'd go, well, that's okay. I like that Hummel. And then that Hummel would disappear from the pile, and I'd think, well, it's okay. There's this Hummel. And by the end, the Hummel that was left, I love the Hummel. I'm not a big Hummel collector, but I still remember my grandmother buy it. But I remember very clearly that to me, the definition of fair and equal was not part of that game. And so I really, it was a very powerful moment as a child, and really stuck with me as I thought about this for such a long period of time and worked with other families. Silent auction. I'm going to say that this is honestly my number one way of distribution. Again, everybody has a different reason and connection to items. And it really isn't our place to determine what is a better connection from one to another. Whether I have a connection to an item because I think it has financial value and must mean and be more because it's more expensive, or because it is something that I remember somebody using, or I just like it aesthetically. I like the way of kind of determining which items are going to be divided within a family, making a list of all of those items, and then individually, not as a group, but individually going off and denoting on that list your number one item that you would like to have, your number 2, 3, 4. It could go down to 40, it could go down to 10, it could go down to 100, depending on how many items are on that list. But you do that individually. Your reasons for choosing that item are yours to hold on to and aren't necessary to share. If we do that kind of list all together as a family, what often happens is my number one isn't what my sister's number one would be. But if I don't particularly have a great relationship with my sister and she wants that item, you can bet that that item has more value to me. Or if I think that somebody is choosing an item because of its financial value and they choose it, then I'm going to think that it is more valuable. It goes to kind of the eBay auction mentality. There's a reason why auctions do so well, because when you start seeing the price go up and more people want to kind of join in, you think to yourself, it must have more value. And this really should be a personal decision. It should be value is in your mind. What happens after these lists are completed is, depending on where people live or how you're going to get back together, is you literally start at the top of the list and find out who in the room ranked it the highest. It may not be number one for anybody, but maybe it's number 5, and that's the highest anybody ranked it. That item is theirs. It doesn't matter if it was chosen because of financial value or emotional value or meaning. They, for whatever reason, put it highest on their list. And you do that with every item. And if there was one item that is duplicated and it has the same number as somebody else's, which is very, very rare, then you leave it to the end and you take those items and re-rank them. Again, it is so rare because when you do this individually, your choices are your own, and very rarely does someone else value the same item in the same way and will rank it the same. The other way, and sometimes a way to kind of reduce this silent auction list, is that some families, if you have given an item as a gift, let's say I gave my mom a coffee table book, that immediately that coffee table book comes back to me. I gave it to her as a gift. I found that there was some reason and a connection for why I wanted to give her that. And so it just comes back to me. And so that's a way sometimes to reduce the items to be divided. Because again, if it's something that you felt strong enough to give as a gift, then receive it back. If it's something you don't want, it could go back on this list. So these are some of the ways to look at distribution. No matter what way we distribute, often there's going to be conflict. And often conflict doesn't mean it can't be solved. It just means that we have come to a situation where everybody is approaching it in a different way. And very rarely is the goal different. Most people want to be able to move through this and be able to come out whole in some way at the end, but how to do that can differ from one person to another. So one of the ways to manage some of this conflict is to be very good listener. And listening requires us to not be thinking of the answer as we're listening to someone's voice, but to allow them to provide the information, to share their ideas, and then thoughtfully to be able to respond. To clarify, we have to make sure, did we hear that right? Are we thinking that what they mean is truly what they meant it to mean? And that's really important. Oftentimes we react so quickly because we really haven't listened. We've only thought how to respond, that we need to clarify statements before we really come upon it in the wrong way. We really need to think about problem solving. And again, while I gave a list of distribution methods and I talked about ways that we can make copies of things and all of that, you may have some other ways in your family to problem solve this. So really think about it, give people an opportunity to think about how to maybe do it better or differently. Think about alternatives, and look up. I'm going to have some resources at the end. Really review those and see what alternatives fit best. And in some situations, you may feel most comfortable going through some type of mediation. And it doesn't necessarily mean kind of in a legal way, but to be able to have someone who is outside of the emotion and be able to kind of help come to goals. Again, as a hospice social worker, I found myself in those situations frequently because, as I used to say to families when I would have conversations, I don't have to sit down with you all at a family dinner. I can approach it differently. I don't have the history, and I don't have the stories, good or bad, to kind of color my view of how we're going into this. And so having somebody else, whether it's a legal person, whether it's a clinical person, to be able to find a different alternative can be very powerful. And moving on, you know, the reality is this often happens as we're getting older. It often happens first with our parents, which means in some ways that we become adult orphans, that we don't have the same connector to bring us together for holiday meals or to be the reason that we kind of put up with our siblings. But what do you want the legacy of the family to be after this activity, after the division of property? So what happens after the distribution to the relationships within the family, and what impact will all of this have? And only you can determine how far do you take the conflict? How far do you take the difficult conversations and the heightened emotion before someone says enough? Before someone realizes that half of the items that I am fighting over are going to end up in storage with all of my other items that I say are so valuable to me. Yet if I showed you a box up in the attic, I would never be able to identify what actually was in that box. And is it worth giving up these relationships for having one more box that you can't identify its contents in your attic? A few years ago, when I was a part of this kind of conversation with my husband's family, I was taking a walk before we went through this all together as a family. And I was listening to my iPod or whatever it was with music. And I came across a Jewel song. And Jewel is a kind of a sappy, folksy kind of singer. But she had a song, and a line kept on coming across really clearly to me. And I kept it in my mind. And I honestly, before we began our conversation as a family that day, I played the song. I'm a social worker. I guess I needed to do that. We were sitting in a circle. It just fit. But the song, the words that made so much sense to me was, in the end, kindness only matters. And I think it is so key that we keep that in mind as we think about this particular topic. And what does that mean for ourselves, for our family, for the persons whose legacy and memory we are trying to honor? Because in the end, kindness only matters. There are some resources that can be really valuable. The first is Who Gets Grandma's Yellow Pie Plate? This book, which you can order online at this website, has a lot of activities that you individually and you as a family can do to really see where everybody's idea of fairness is, and equality and all of that. The Boomer Burden, Dealing with Your Parents' Lifetime Accumulation of Stuff, is another great resource. And A Family United, A Family Divided, at the website familyfight.com. And this is an attorney who has looked at kind of estate planning from both the financial end all the way through the division of personal assets. If you would like to learn more about Synergy Home Care Services in your local area, and how one of our local offices can provide some training to any of your groups, please feel free to reach out to us either by our website at synergyhomecare.com, give a call to our 1-800 number, or to contact me at carlasutter@synergyhomecare.com. And again, if you would like to receive your certificate of attendance, please contact me at that email, and I will send that out within 24 hours. Again, this will be on the recorded webinar. Will also be on our YouTube channel within the next 24 hours. I'm going to go ahead and take some questions. Let me just go through the list and go back. If you did write down that you'd like to receive your certificate of attendance, if you could just send me an email so I have your email access and contact info, that would be great. So someone who has left talked about fear of the way siblings will act. And, again, unfortunately, that is the reality in many families. And some of it is that the family, no matter what is occurring, can't find a way, a third way of trying to do this fairly or with kindness. My hope would be that taking some of the techniques that we've talked about today will kind of help mitigate some of those. And then it's also how important is the fight to you to keep this going. What do you do when you're involved with a divided family when trying to talk to them about dividing up property? Again, I think sometimes if it's difficult to do it in person, initially is to maybe start asking some questions, giving people an opportunity to voice some of their concerns or some of their answers to questions about a certain topic, and then be able to come back and kind of talk about each person's responses. Thinking about some of the techniques that we've talked about and see which would be the least emotional, with the least emotional kind of minefields. And are there some techniques that we can divide this property, give everybody the sense and the peace of having some of these memories without it becoming a drag-out fight and literally trying to divide the piece of jewelry or the cutting the canvas down the center. Can you please go over the return to sender concept? So again, that is really if you have given an item for a gift, or maybe you went in on an item with somebody, you then receive that back, kind of no questions asked. If it's an item you don't want, then it goes in with all of the other items as part of the list or whatever other division technique that your family has put together. Are there any other questions? I'll wait for another minute or so. I know that this is a very can be a very emotional topic. If someone has something that they would like to ask privately, again, feel free to reach out to me via my email address, and I would be glad to help. Someone did ask if I am available to mediate. And again, hopefully there's some things that you've taken away from this in this particular situation, because I know that person. I'd be glad to have more conversation one-on-one. And let's see. What if one brother asks the other brother for a key at the funeral so that he can go get what he wants? My sense is that one brother is asking the other, which is the executor, and that there may be kind of not a great, I don't want to use this too legally, but an illicit kind of relationship between those that are complicit. Again, sometimes the reality is we're not going to be able to change the history and the dynamic that has been developed over such a long period of time. I think that it is okay to say out loud, guys, I'm really concerned that this is going to happen. I really want to be able to have a relationship after all of this is done. So is there something that we can do to make a change? Here are some slides. Here are some different techniques. Is there one of these that we can all agree on? All right. I think that is the end of the questions. Thank you all so much. Again, next month, please keep an eye out for the same way that you received information about this session. You will receive information about the next January session. So I look forward to having that topic.